Hello, this is video lecture number 15, the Mid-Century Challenge. We've got a few sections that we're going to cover today. The first is the French and Indian War, then the Great War for Empire, British industrial growth and the Consumer Revolution, the struggle for land, Western rebels, and regulators. So let's get started. In the years 1740 to 1765, the British Empire in North America was redefined by three sets of events. The French and Indian War, an expansion of transatlantic trade that increased prosperity but raised colonial debt, and a great westward movement. In the late 1740s, a shortage of land and the influx of immigrants into the middle and southern colonies brought pressure for expansion, leading to a clash between the British and the French for the interior of North America. When William Pitt the Elder became First Minister in 1757, he devised a strategy that turned the conflict into a great war for empire. The turning point in North America was the British capture of Quebec in 1759. The war ended with the reduction of the French Empire in North America to a handful of islands. As the colonial population continued to expand, serious land shortages led to conflicts over land rights, Indian policy, law and order, and political representation. For example, Connecticut fought with Pennsylvania over the settlement in the Wyoming Valley. In Pennsylvania, conflicts between Scots-Irish immigrants along the frontier and the Quaker political establishment stirred violence and nearly led to civil war. So let's begin with our examination of this mid-century challenge with our first section, which briefly looks at the French and Indian War. Indians, who in 1750 still controlled the interior of North America, used their control of the fur trade to bargain with both the British and the French. The Iroquois strategy of playing off the French against the British was breaking down as European resentment of the costs of gifts of arms and money rose. Indian alliances crumbled in the face of escalating Anglo-American demands for land. The Ohio Company obtained a royal grant of 200,000 acres along the upper Ohio River, land that was controlled by Indians. To counter Britain's movement into the Ohio Valley, the French set up a series of forts. The French seized George Washington and his men as they tried to support the Ohio Company's claim to the land. And this was one of the initial missions that George Washington had in his military career, and it was a failure. Britain dispatched forces to America where they joined with the colonial militia in attacking these French forts. In June of 1755, British and New England troops captured a fort in Nova Scotia and deported 10,000 French Catholic Acadians to France, Louisiana, or the West Indies. In July, General Edward Braddock and his British and colonial troops were soundly defeated by a small group of French and Indians at Fort Duquesne. So let's look at this great war for empire in our next section. By 1756, the fighting in America had spread to Europe, where it arrayed France, Spain, and Austria against Britain and Prussia in a greater conflict known as the 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War in the colonies. Britain saw France as its main obstacle to further expansion in profitable overseas trading. William Pitt, a committed expansionist, planned to cripple France by attacking its colonies. The fall of Quebec, which was the heart of France's American empire, was the turning point of this war. The British ousted French traders from India, seized French territory in West Africa, as well as the sugar islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and won Cuba from the Philippines from Spain. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 granted British sovereignty over half of the continent of North America. French territory was reduced then to a handful of islands in the West Indies and 2 islands off the coast of Newfoundland. Britain's victory alarmed Indian peoples who feared an influx of Anglo-American settlers. In 1763, the Ottawa chief Pontiac led a group of loosely confederated tribes in a major uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion. This was against the British, capturing many British garrisons and killing or capturing over 2,000 settlers. This Indian alliance gradually weakened, and they eventually accepted the British, though, as their new political fathers. In return, the British established the Proclamation Line of 1763, barring settlers from going west of the Appalachians, and this will be important later. So let's go to the next section, British industrial growth and the Consumer Revolution. Britain had unprecedented economic resources, and by 1750, its combination of strong commerce and industry made it the most powerful nation in the world. The new machines and business practices of the Industrial Revolution allowed Britain to sell goods at lower prices, particularly in the mainland colonies. Americans paid for British imports by increasing their exports of wheat, rice, and tobacco. This increased trade resulted in something we call the Consumer Revolution that raised the living standard of many Americans. The first American spending binge landed many of these colonists in debt. The loss of military subsidies prompted an economic recession. Americans had become dependent on overseas creditors and international economic conditions. Okay, so let's go to the next section, which is the struggle for land in the East. The growth of the colonial population caused conflicts over land, particularly in Pennsylvania and Connecticut. Settlers from the two colonies asserted their claims by burning down their rivals' houses and barns. Wappinger Indians, Massachusetts migrants, and Dutch settlers all tried to claim manor lands in the Hudson River Valley. Mob violence erupted but was quashed by General Thomas Gage, whose men joined local sheriffs and bailiffs. English aristocrats in New Jersey and in the southern colonies successfully asserted their legal claims to land based on what were really outdated charters. Proprietary power then increased the resemblance between rural societies in Europe and in America. Tenants and freeholders looked west then for cheap freehold land near the Appalachian Mountains. So let's look at these Western rebels and regulators. Movement to the Western frontier created new disputes over Indian policy, political representation, and debt. In Pennsylvania, Scots-Irish demands for the expulsion of Indians and the ensuing massacre led by the Paxton Boys left a legacy of racial hatred and political resentment. In 1763, land-owning vigilantes known as the North Carolina Regulators demanded greater political rights, local courts, and fairer taxes. In 1766, a more radical regulator movement arose in the backcountry of North Carolina, caused by plummeting tobacco prices that forced debt-ridden farmers into court. To save their farms, debtors joined with the regulators to intimidate judges, close courts, and free their comrades from jail. The royal governor mobilized the Eastern militia against this regulator force, which resulted in the eventual defeat of the regulators and the execution of their leaders. Tied to Britain, yet growing resistant of its control, America had the potential for independent existence. And this does conclude our video lecture for today. So, please answer the review questions below in your notes and continue on to your reading.